Now we're going to move on to the final session of the day, Reproducibility 2.0, and I'm going to invite Sophie Scott back, who opened our session today. Hiya, Sophie. She's going to be chairing our discussion, and also here we have got Katya, David, Yuri, and Marcus. And I think we're going with. So from that, I'll hand over to Sophie.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Jo. And I'm just so very generally, we're going to be talking. We have a panel of experts who are going to talk about different aspects of reproducibility. There's going to be a great discussion about the future of reproducible science, and everybody's going to speak for 5 minutes. And we aren't going to take questions in between that, and then we'll move on to a discussion. And do put your questions in the chat, because I will bring those into the discussion when we get to the group discussion at the end. Is that okay? So our first speaker, who's going to give us a nice short presentation, is Dr. Katerina Dama from Prolific. Hi, Katerina. Are you here?
Yes.
Excellent. Over to you for your 5 minutes.
I cannot turn on the video. Oh, here we go. Okay. Hi. I didn't know I go first, but okay, I'll go now. All right. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to argue that science needs revolution, not reform. 10 years ago, the replication crisis started, and it was propelled by a paper by Simons, Nelson, and Simonson from 2011 that showed that anything can be presented as statistically significant if only the scientist wants to do so. That means that science can be cheated very easily, and it's very gameable. And you can cheat on so many different levels, from how you develop your theory and hypotheses, how you design your study, how you collect the data, how you analyze the data, how you interpret it, and how you write up and frame your paper. So how and why is this possible? Well, the paper by Simons and colleagues showed how common questionable research practices are, things like p-hacking or optional stopping. But I'm actually going to say that there's a deeper layer to this problem, which is around incentives. Fundamentally, because in science, in academia, I should say, incentives aren't aligned, you're having essentially a broken system. So it's publish or perish. And the people who publish the best are the ones who make it to the very top, typically. So we can, of course, continue building all sorts of tools, like registered reports, or infrastructure like the Open Science Framework, or even international collaborations like the Psychological Science Accelerator. But as long as the system is incentivizing the wrong behaviors, our efforts are basically pointless, in my opinion. So here's my pitch. I think we need to rethink and reimagine academia from scratch. We need academia 2.0, and we need a proper credibility revolution. This is a term that Simin Vazir from the University of Melbourne has coined. So I think the gradual progress that we've seen in the past 10 years has been way too slow. We're wasting taxpayer money, we're wasting our own time and energy, and we continue publishing rubbish research. Okay, so what's the difference between reform and revolution? A reform is typically gradual improvement. Revolution is a more kind of fundamental, profound, or sudden change. So how do we revolutionize academia? I'm going to borrow some ideas from the startup world. We need to approach it from first principles. So we need to start with the basic building blocks. How do you build a system that works? So this is how I would do it if I had the choice. So for Academia 2.0, we would need, one, the right rewards and incentives. So for example, we would have to offer tenure based on rigor of research, not based on the prestige of the journals or publications. Two, we need better accountability and feedback mechanisms. For example, there should be a performance review process for professors. Otherwise, they'll become complacent and just publish papers that might not even be rigorous. And 3, we need a much stronger and more transparent publishing and peer review system. For example, preprints are now emerging as really good alternatives to journal articles. And I also think that peer review should be paid. You know, why are so many scientists doing work for free? And it should also be a lot more transparent. Can we accomplish all of this through reform? I don't think so. I predict that a startup will come along in the future and rebuild academia 2.0 from scratch. And in fact, we're already seeing something like that in education. There's a startup called Lambda School that is disrupting the way education is financed. So this is my pitch.
Thank you very much. Big news for everybody who doesn't realise that professors are annually reviewed, certainly at UCL. We are now going to our next speaker, and our next speaker is going to be Yuri Simonson from Barcelona. Yuri, do we have you?
Yes, I'm trying to get my hi, just seeing on my screen.
Over to you.
I do have some slides. Can you confirm if you see them?
Yes, see them.
Okay, great. So I'm Yuri Simonson. I'm in Barcelona, and also I have a foot still at Wharton, where I was for many years. And they told me to speak at most 5 minutes, as little as possible. 1 minute would be great. So I'll keep it short. And this is an unusual presentation for me. It's kind of like an ad for stuff that I have been doing when I'm not doing my research, and we're building infrastructure for conducting research. And I'll focus on ResearchBox, the newest one in our set. But to give you some background for the Credibility Lab, our goal is to make it easier for people to conduct more credible research. And so far we have 3 products to give them a name. As predicted, which is for pre-registration, to give you a sense of how common pre-registration has become. We were going to have a conference in Barcelona in 2020, but COVID got in the way, but not before we got all the submissions. And about half the submissions that were sent were pre-registered. So this is about 300 and some submissions of empirical work, mostly experiments. And about half of them were pre-registered. Most of them were as predicted. This is the academic world that's closest to me. So I suspect that's why we have a high market share. I suspect as we go further from judgment decision-making, OSF would be more important, relatively speaking. I don't think this is representative. But half the submissions are pre-registered would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. And this shows the growth since we launched as predicted, how many new pre-registrations we're receiving per month. We're getting about 2,000 per month now, which is it's incredible. When we launched it, we decided we get 100 a year. We would keep it running. A second product that we launched recently is simply an R package that makes reproducible R code more easy. So there's this problem, and I won't get to talk about details now, but the problem with, oh, do you have me? I guess my video is off. Sorry about that. A problem that we have with R is that the packages get updated, and when they get updated, your existing code can break. So we create groundhog so that your code will run like in the movie. It will always be the date that you write down. And all you have to do to make your R code reproducible is, instead of using the library command, you now use groundhog library. And this package will always be loaded as it was available that day. This is just a preamble to the third product, so to speak, which is ResearchBox. I'll give you a little bit more information about. And it seeks to make open research easier by making it fast, structured, standardized, and findable. So to give you an example of that, here's a box. If you go, you can do this now while I'm speaking. If you go to ResearchBox 15, that's a box that I created, and it shows all the files that are available in this standardized table, and it's also a structured table. We call them the bingo table because it resembles a bingo card, and that is that it should be easy, like as in American English, when you say bingo, when you find something, to find anything you're looking for. So these are all the files, and I think this will work. Can you see my browser as well? Do you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say, so it has instantaneous previews, and it's very easy to navigate. So for example, let's say you want to look at the data for study 1. If you click here, it immediately opens a preview very quickly. And one thing we do is that every single data file has a code book. The website helps you create the code book for it. So if you want to know what each variable is, because for example, what does check mean? It may be hard to figure out, or what rent order means, etc. You can just click the book and it shows you the code book for each of the variables. And every single data set in ResearchBox has this structure for code books. You can also preview code in the same easy manner. So it's all instantaneous. And to download it, if you want to download, you can select specific files that you want to download, or you can download everything in one click. So we seek to make that as easy as possible. So I'm returning to my presentation. So in terms of like the bigger vision, right? So this was a pitch for this new product of ours, but we were asked to think like Reproducibility 2.0, how is it going to be different? I think the main vision that drove us creating ResearchBox in comparison to the OSF or Dataverse or other solutions is that right now it's relatively easy to sort of dump your files somewhere. So if you want to be open, you can just dump them, and people can, if they go through enough effort, they can find them. But I have a view that if we make the files that we search easy enough to use, a whole lot of potential opens up that right now is not really being tapped. So I'll just give you concrete examples. I've often been reviewing a paper that has a link to open materials or open data, but it's so difficult to actually find what you're looking for that it just imposes an extra burden. Like Katja was saying, we're not being paid to be reviewers, so anything we can do to make it easy for them would be good. So the premise is if we make it easy to look at the open research files, people will actually look at them when they evaluate any work. Then I'm sometimes a methodologist. I write papers how to do better analysis of data. And a lot of methodology papers rely on simulated data that may or may not reflect real data, and they're solving problems that real researchers may or may not be facing. If it's very easy for methodologists to look at data and find it and see what people are doing, how they're being analyzed, we believe this openness will lead to more relevant methodological work. Another thing is, if you think about all the effort that goes into generating data, and for it to just be stored somewhere and never used again, if it's easy to find, for example, a research box, you can search data sets by variable descriptions. So you could easily find any data set that uses happiness or reaction time or a particular stimuli. You can look for code. Any posted box that has a particular package or a function within a package, you could find it and use it. This should give more value to all the work that we're producing. If you're building on existing work, there's nothing beats being able to easily reproduce or seeing the kind of data they got, the materials they had. And last but not least, in terms of learning how to run particular research studies or how to analyze data in one particular way, if everything's very easy to find, imagine you're trying to learn a new function and you don't know how to use it. You can find a paper that is relevant to you, and you can just search for that function to find it. We believe it's going to dramatically increase the benefits of making things public. And in my assessment, this is of course biased, right? I'm motivated to believe ResearchBox is better, but I believe no existing platform allows for any of this potential to be materialized. All we have is just like somewhat difficult to obtain stored files, and we're hoping that this new platform will reach the potential that we believe open science has. And that's my presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Uri. Now, our next speaker is David Rothschild from Microsoft Research. We got you, David?
Yep. Can you guys hear me?
I can indeed. Over to you.
Okay. So what I'm going to talk about is add in another concept of replicability, which is thinking about this in terms of external validity. So one thing is to be able to replicate something in the laboratory area. One thing is to be able to replicate it with whatever tools you're using. Another thing is, does it actually replicate in the outcome space that you care about? And I'll start with a warning. So this is from a paper that's currently under review, where we just simply asked people in a bunch of these various tools in which people get respondents, how much do the respondents actually use these various services, frequency of hours spent on these types of sites. And you're going to see this is a lot of time responding. And of course, prolific and MTurk, and CR is a filtered version of Mechanical Turk. These are places where people are going to kind of work and do tasks. In earlier work, we'd also asked this on Qualtrics and other online panels, where you still had the majority of people spending several hours per week answering questions in various audiences. And so that should kind of baseline affect your understanding of the naivete and understanding of various respondents that may be used in online laboratory experiments or surveys in order to better understand the world. And I can move forward into kind of my main area of work, and I'll just kind of jump through different hoops on it. One is ad effectiveness, and this is from a paper that is going to be sent out soon. I apologize, I had to at the last moment cover the names of the companies that are in there. But the point is, we're looking at ad effectiveness in 50 brands, pretty big brands, but not crazy. And if you just go to the far left panel, mean brand impressions per household. So what we noticed is that we were doing observational work here, followed up by some laboratory work, and that on our observational data, the mean brand, the median brand, sorry, was hitting about 39 to 40 times for any household in our study. So we're looking at how much any individual ad is affecting people, but the average household was getting hit by 39 ads from a given brand. And so that's a lot of baseline exposure if you're trying to look at the marginal impact of a given ad. Work that we're doing right now in politics, we're looking at this kind of paradox about the ineffectiveness of advertising in some ways. But what we're going to report soon is that the average American, even though they consume very little news, is getting hit by more earned media. So even just containing on TV, they're getting hit by more actual just news than they are on ads, a lot more. And so if you're worried about the marginal effect, you have to worry about where people are coming from originally. And this really plays a lot into some really interesting research, which around vaccine hesitancy. Again, a lot of laboratory experiments in how you can shift people's minds on taking vaccines, but you have to put it into the context of the massive amount of understanding and thought people have already put into the process. I'll jump quickly into questions around market design, which I spend a lot of time on as well. This is a very common question. It's asking for confidence intervals, a very heavily replicated result that people are overconfident when they're answering this type of question, where they're trying to give their 80% range of when something's going to happen. Working with Dan Goldstein and others, we created a lot of user interfaces that can essentially just eliminate that type of error. People are even able to reproduce crazy distributions of numbers they saw and things like that. But then the question is who's right and who's wrong? We don't really know here. It depends on thinking a lot about under what context do we care about this type of interaction or this type of thought process about confidence. Surely the type of work we're doing is making people constantly helping with the user interface. And at the end of the day, we looked at a simple question which said, how are people making money effectively? And basically, the short of it is that people who understood the user interface and actually made the most cost-effective trade for any trade they were doing were making more money than other people, because the vast majority of people weren't even doing the trade properly. They were below the 45-degree line. It means here that they are at any given time purchasing the exact same asset for more money than they could have if they fully understood the interface. We test these things in lab. We taught people too well. People are much quicker and lazier, busier in the real world, and actually continue to make mistakes, which we are able to prove over and over again were effective in a laboratory setting. I'll jump quickly to public opinion. This is a really cool table on a paper by John Krosnick. And what I really love about it is that this kind of shows in the opposite direction. He used this table, specifically the fourth line of data to show, hey, the errors on these non-probability internet samples are 1 to 2 percentage points higher than if you use probability samples. This is saying if you go on the internet and you get people coming from panels, you're not going to get as accurate in describing basically census data as you do on telephones. Interesting, meaningful, maybe. But the point being is that 1 to 2 percentage points is actually not that bad for a lot of things people care about, and actually is well within the range that most people would accept for something that was a lot cheaper. And there's a lot of questions that go into public opinion where there's no underlying value. So it's very tricky to kind of understand what a few percentage points really mean, especially when you start kind of comparing. Even a bunch of really hardcore ground truth has a lot of error when it comes to, or differences when it comes to sentiment. And so if you move away from questions like what's your age, gender, marriage status, to questions of what you care about in public policy, well, people don't have very stable opinions. And so to understand what that means in externally valid state is super tricky. We know that people love infrastructure and basically the democratic agenda. We know that the vote's a lot tighter than that when people go out and vote. And so it's a question of maybe people are answering this question truthfully. Maybe we actually have a very replicable thing, but maybe it doesn't translate for various reasons that we're still trying to learn. And I'll leave you with one more thought, which is that there's a lot of studies about the effect of news, and people want to understand how much does being treated with news affect your baseline public opinion. And we can replicate over and over and over again people saying that somewhere around 35 to 40% of people say they're regular Fox News viewers. But what the bottom line here shows is that number one, about 14% of people ever consume Fox News for a 6-minute spell in a given month. And so we can replicate in polling and in laboratory people claiming to be Fox News viewers, but they're actually not if you look at the data. And so it causes all sorts of questions about what does it mean when people who watch Fox News are different than people who don't watch Fox News. And we can go into that later, but the point being is some questions are just too hard. And so we need to use passive data, but also they fully replicate over and over again. It doesn't make them necessarily true. Thank you.
Very much, and I have to say, well, thank you for bringing your top bow tie game to these talks.
I thought it was a formal presentation.
It's very good. I like it. And now our next speaker is Marcus Mufano from the University of Bristol. Marcus, have we got you?
We have, hopefully. I hope you can hear me all right and see my slides. Thanks for the invitation to speak. Thanks, Sophie, for introducing me. There's a lot going on at the moment in the UK, but nationally, around research culture and research incentives, and Katya spoke to that. We don't have to think too hard to see the ways in which our culture is in many ways very old in terms of the ways in which we work and the tension that that's creating in terms of the incentives that exist and shape our behavior. For example, the way in which we disseminate knowledge via journal articles is still predicated on paper being expensive. All of those constraints that you can meet that mean you can only have so many words and tables and figures and so on are all a vestige of that way of disseminating knowledge on dead trees. So it's an important question to ask, how can we do better? How can we improve the culture within which we work, the incentives that shape our behavior, and as a result, the quality of the work that we produce? And that last comment that David made, I think is worth bearing in mind. Replicable does not mean that we get the right answer. We can end up with very large studies that give us very precise and very precisely wrong answers to our underlying question if we're not careful. So we need to think about more than just replicability. Katya mentioned this study, which is very important in terms of flexibility that we have in our studies and the extent to which we can leverage that flexibility to generate a spurious finding and can be led astray by our own cognitive biases because we want to find something. But that's not news. And in 1988, Richard Peto published a trial of aspirin and the protective effect on heart disease, and was asked by reviewers to include a post hoc subgroup analysis. And he said, I'll only do it if I can add my own post hoc subgroup analysis to demonstrate that the ease with which you can generate spurious results if you do that. And with his own subgroup analysis showed that if you're born under Capricorn, the effect of aspirin on heart disease risk is much more beneficial. In other words, he used astrological signs for his subgroup analysis to demonstrate how rolling the dice multiple times gets you the wrong answer. I think the real message of this paper is that when you read something in the published literature, you have no way of knowing whether you're reading a full account of everything that happened, which is the full abstract that's shown here, or a redacted, curated storytelling version that's intended to sell the paper, which is the compact version shown in bold. You simply don't know, because part of our culture leads us to a model of research which relies on trust, trusting individual researchers to give a full and complete account of everything that they did. And what we need to move toward, which many others have said, including Samin Vazir, but also David Spiegelhalter at Cambridge, is that we need to build a system, a process that is inherently trustworthy, rather than one that relies on trust in individuals, because people are fallible, have their own cognitive biases. Their behavior is shaped by the incentive structures that we work within. We're all human, in other words. So how can we introduce approaches to working that create a trustworthy system? One insight, which was taken by Edwards Deming, the statistician, to the Japanese automobile industry in the 1970s, is that if you introduce quality control checks throughout a process, then of course you create higher quality outputs. The Japanese automobile industry started producing reliable cars for the first time, because previously cars were unreliable, and dominated the market, and still has a reputation for reliability today. So the analogy is that we produce scientific papers to be fixed later, a bit like the automobile industry in the US in the 1970s produced cars to be fixed later, the era of the lemon, the irredeemably badly built car. But the less intuitive insight that Deming's had was that, yes, if you focus on quality throughout a process, you produce higher quality outputs at the end of that process, but you also improve efficiency, because you're not investing time fixing cars that broke down later or correcting claimed findings that turn out to be false. So if we want to advance knowledge efficiently, if we want to transfer that knowledge to societal impact and translate it into societal impact more rapidly, we need to focus on quality. So how can we improve quality? The problem that we have is that we have an interconnected system with lots of stakeholders, each of which have a part to play. So this article describes some of the threats to the scientific process, some of the potential changes to that process that could improve the way in which we work and improve the quality of what we produce. But this requires the coordination of journals, funders, institutions, and researchers themselves. One area where researchers can do a great deal is by working more transparently, by making as much of their research process available to scrutiny as possible. To create more external quality control, people will spot the mistakes that we make in our work, because we will make mistakes in any human endeavor. We've all read journal articles that have been read by multiple authors, that have been through peer review, that have been read by an editor, that have been copy edited, that have been proofread, and they still have typos in them. So our code will, and our data will, and we need to create processes that allow those honest errors to be caught and corrected to improve our quality and to improve our efficiency. External checking is part of that, but by making our workflows available for scrutiny, in the knowledge that others may check our work, that also creates an incentive for greater internal quality control. In other words, you check your data set 4 or 5 times before you post it, rather than 2 or 3 times, because you don't want someone to spot an error. But that coordination is key. You can have funders that are mandating data sharing, for example, and you can have researchers that want to do that, but you need the incentives to motivate them to do it, because not all researchers will be equally motivated, and you need the infrastructure to support it. So that's why we've set up the UK Reproducibility Network, which is a peer-led organization that has at its base local networks of researchers, self-organizing groups of researchers motivated to engage with these issues. But we also have institutions that have joined. So in the UK, at the moment, we have 57 local networks at different institutions. We have 20 institutions themselves that have joined, working at a different level, working at the level of things like promotion and hiring criteria, and how you can use those to incentivize open research practices and other changes that we might want to incentivize. And then we have the external stakeholders, the funders, the publishers, the learning societies, the professional bodies, and the other sectoral organizations, because we need to be creating those linkages and making sure that we coordinate our efforts across and between those different levels. And of course, this is an international effort. So science is global. And so we're now starting to see reproducibility networks modeled on that same structure, which gives that flexibility to tailor solutions locally while still coordinating across and between levels. We're starting to see these emerge in other countries. So we have them in Australia, Germany, Switzerland, and Slovakia at the moment. Several other countries that are interested in developing their own reproducibility networks. And so that coordination can then extend to a global scale.
Thank you very much, Marcus. And now we are over to our last speaker, who's Joe, now not sharing a session, but giving us a talk. Hi, Joe.
Hello, thank you. Let's see if I can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, great. So hi, I'm Joe Evershad from Gorilla, and we help behavioral scientists create and host online experiments quickly and easily. I want to talk about where this journey towards better reproducibility leads. As the Cheshire Cat says, if you don't know where you're going, it doesn't matter which way you go. And I think it does very much matter. Reproducibility of findings is important to ensure that science is robust. I believe we've come a long way in the last 10 years. We've analysed the problem, we've proposed and developed and tested several solutions. And now what's left is to get the incentives right and implement these solutions. From that perspective, reproducibility is increasingly a solved problem, although there is still plenty of work to be done to implement the solution. As an example, when I was a student 10 years ago, underpowered studies were the norm. Online behavioural research has changed all that. With Gorilla Open Materials, you can read a paper, access their protocol and clone it for replication in just 3 mouse clicks. And with the recruitment service, you can launch it online and get a representative sample of 500 people in a lunch break. And with Researchbox, you can then store the data analysis for posterity. That's dramatic progress. I'm not sure exactly where we are on this journey, but I think we can see the path ahead. But reproducibility is not everything. It's only part of the journey. So what's the ultimate destination? In other words, what's at the top of the mountain? Knowing what we're aiming for will ensure we get the right processes and safeguards in place. So I think this is the full journey. We want our science to be reproducible so that our findings are robust, and then generalizable so that we're confident that they work in novel contexts, and then impactful so they're confident that they can be used in the real world. And then we have the prize, evidence-based products and services of the future. I'd like to see the behavioural sciences informing the products and services of the future and improving lives. At Gorilla, we talk about how the behavioural sciences can be leveraged to improve health, wealth, happiness, and education. For me, that's what's at the top of the mountain. And to do this, we need more pathways out of academia and into innovation. For everyone in the audience that can see a problem in the world with a behavioural solution, we want to give you the tools to research that problem, develop and test that solution, and take that with you out of your academia and make it happen. Perhaps surprisingly, behavioural science academics make ideal entrepreneurs. We understand human behaviour, we're good with numbers, we're tech savvy. A lot of the skills developed in academia translate well to startups. Pitching for grant funding isn't that different to pitching for investment. Running a lab isn't that different to running a startup. In both, you're improvising and experimenting and thinking deeply about what works. And as we've seen from today, academics are great at standing up in front of a crowd and sharing what they know. But entrepreneurs have the added bonus of being able to create a sustainable funding model. And as a case in point, moving into entrepreneurship is what me and Katya from Prolific did instinctively. So we're trying to help build this pipeline so that the impact section of your grant proposal isn't the end, but the springboard for the next step of productizing your research. Right now, we stop at the third circle and then go back to the start. But we've come all this way. Why are we stopping now? At Gorilla, we've been developing new tools to make it easier to design and test products and services of the future by making them more ecologically valid. With Game Builder, we hope to inspire a generation of education and development researchers to create games that can be used in classrooms to train and develop students. With Shop Builder, we're giving researchers the tools needed to nudge behavior. These tools are designed to enable much more rollout-ready findings so that the leap to the fourth circle here is smaller. I'm saddened when I see products or policies based on ideologies or personal opinion, but that's what risks happening if we leave a void. Instead, we could create pathways from academia to industry so we can take our findings and roll them out responsibly. That way, we can ensure that the science isn't corrupted as it's translated into practice. One exciting idea that I want to leave you with is that product development doesn't stop once you launch it. Imagine what you can find out when you have 2,000 people using your product every day. What about with 200,000? Imagine the power of that study. Imagine how much more robust your findings will be when you can run micro experiments every day and see what works. Once taken to market, an educational maths game like Diana's game that we saw yesterday could and should continue to analyze player learning and behavior to further improve the game. This sort of flywheel where scientific advancement for the betterment of society is self-funding will mean better products and services. It's a different way of disseminating knowledge than printing it on bits of dead wood. And over the last 2 days, we've heard lots of ideas that could turn into products or services, from games to life-saving interventions. To me, this is what it would mean to be a behavioral scientist in industry and to work on products with a strong evidence base. Yes, there are complexities around how to use end user data responsibly, but I believe we can get there. Many of us want to have a positive impact on the world and leave a legacy. Given that so many of the challenges that face society are behavioral, you're ideally positioned to do this. We're making the tools to make that possible, but we need you to want it and dream it, and to then go out into the world and do it.
Thank you very much, Jo, and thank you to all the speakers. We've now got about 25 minutes for questions and discussion. So if you have anything that you'd like to say, please put it in the Q&A. And I will bring those to the committee, sorry, the panel. In the meantime, well, I suppose I'd like to ask the other members of the panel, what did you think about Jo's point about it's not just where we've come from and where we are, but where we're going to? Could I start with you, Katja?
I could not agree more. I don't really know what else to say. I mean, we should be thinking about the future, right? What do we want to see in the future? Yeah, I just couldn't agree more, basically.
Thank you. David?
Well, I think it touches on what a lot of people have been talking about, which is the evolution of academic publishing. And we've talked a lot on the replication side about the data that goes in. I think one thing that was not noted enough, and I think is worth noting, is there is an incredible cost on researchers in order to reach the replication standard that we want to do. And there's also a lot of questions about privacy and data that just simply can't be shared for various reasons. And I think that it's a really costly time for those of us who are trying to make the standards because we're in a transition phase. And to Jo's point and others' points, I really look towards startups. I look towards people who can monetize in many ways in order to make it a more efficient system so that there's more vertical integration and that the costs aren't so incredibly high, because it's a super frustrating experience for many of us. And on the output side, I look forward to the movement past dead trees. We have been working on building HTML versions of a lot of our papers, live versions where data continues to flow, easy replication, but again, super, super costly. Coming from an academic lab, we're not going to design the software that's ultimately going to take over. And so we're building experimentation on it. And again, another look towards industry to kind of get that right in order to lower the costs to make it happen. And I just want to shout out to all of the, especially the younger researchers who are just slammed because of this transition period. It's tough, and it's tough to make replication standards in a lot of papers. And I know that there's a lot of late nights in order to go from to do it all right, but then to also make it so that it reaches the standards which we all want to be at.
Thank you. Yuri, did you have any comments?
No, actually, I wanted to ask just a quick follow-up to David. When you say you're experimenting with the HTML papers, this is just for your own papers, not for a platform. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So we're working out of the lab that I principal with Duncan Watts at the University of Pennsylvania. We're putting up new dashboards, and we're taking every one of our papers and trying to build kind of HTML versions where we can take the kind of flat charts that are in the paper and build interactive charts where you can click on them and you can see various subgroups, et cetera, et cetera. And so that for data in which is still flowing in, this is especially true for observational data, that the charts could just continue to grow. So if we did a study period from 2016 to 2020 and the data is still flowing in, we can actually make it so that there's a set version of it, but then there's also a live dashboard version of it that just continues to grow, and people can make their own comments and kind of expand from there. But the idea is to make those, but obviously we're hiring up and hiring data engineers, but it's a process.
Thank you. Marcus, did you have any thoughts about Jo's?
Just to agree, I think if you want to get anywhere, you have to have a clear sense of where you're going. And, if we were to design from scratch a sector that would deliver the things that we ask academia to deliver, I'm not sure it would look exactly like what we have at the moment. That means that we then need to confront some of the challenges, like the fact that we have an overproduction problem, I would say, in academia, that we don't resource what we do well enough. So the whole business model of academia is sort of predicated on the assumption that academics will work evening to weekends. Those are the things that we really need to grapple with when we think about what we want the future to look like, and then we can map a path from where we are to where we want to be.
Thank you. There's a question that's come in on the chat, which I thought was quite interesting, and it was something that's kind of been at the back of my mind through a lot of discussions around this area. So it's all very excellent ideas about how to sort of improve many different aspects of what we do in science. But this is from Katia Ferreira de Oliveira. I'm sorry, I mangled your name there. But she's worried about where the theory is going in this, where theory sits. And it is, if we place everything on rigor, we lose a lot, or potentially could lose a lot in terms of, you know, you made the point, Marcus, about what it is we're actually doing. And it was there in David's talk as well. So I think, where do you see that sitting within this, and how can we maintain the same standards of rigor around theorizing and modeling around our work?
I could comment on that.
Please do.
I would say, so it's all about collaboration and representation. If you only have one person who's a thought leader, and they get a prestigious award at a conference, I don't think that's going to get us anywhere. What we need is groups of people that are diverse working together in developing theories, and there needs to be a process where they debate and reconcile. And I'm not sure I see this sufficiently. There's still all sorts of professors and senior tenured academics who just push their pet theories, and I think it's just totally insufficient. That's my perspective.
I have a thought on this. It's not a really well put together thought, so I'd love to hear what other people take from this. But I was struck by a separation in physics between theoretical physicists and experimental physicists. So they have experimentalists going out and collecting data and making that data available. And these are people who are experts at designing studies and getting really interesting data. And then you have theoretical physicists who come and take those data sets and look at it and then think deeply about the theories and see what might fit these data sets. That's as much as I understand the physics. And I wonder whether we need to see some of that practice come to the behavioral science, so that we can look at both sides and be in conversation with each other. Because maybe it's got too much for one person to be able to do all of it, but maybe it does all need to still be in somebody's head. So it's really a question. It was a thought.
I'm going to jump in here and pretend to be a panelist, not just a chair, then I'll shut up.
Please do.
But I think even designing your study, you'll make theoretical assumptions. Everything we've heard about theory was baked in, even if people don't know that was a theory they were working from. So I think it's not that easy to separate it. When you're running an experiment, you are theorizing. You are working with a theory behind it. So I think and actually more discussion of that rather than less is something that I would like to see. Anyway, you're not here to hear about from me. Would anybody else like to?
No, but I think that's exactly what the physicists do. It means that the experimental physicists it means you've got two groups of people working on it together and passing it around between themselves. But it might be that it still all needs to be in one person's head at the moment. I don't know, but yeah.
I mean, I think that one of the things I'm always struck by in psychology and cognitive neuroscience is how little we spell out our assumptions when we're designing a paper, when we're, kind of thinking about, designing a study. It's actually the degree to which we are working from a completely unspoken set of assumptions, which are pure theory, is a real issue. Anyway, enough from me. Anybody else like to talk about theory?
Add one point, which is, and this will be a nod to Yuri and as predicted and pre-registration, which is that I've noticed in my career going from a point where things were very expensive, right when I started out, people are still using labs, and my advisor really made me write out everything that I was planning to do and write out all the tables with synthetic data and have it all perfect, being like, you got one shot because this is going to blow your entire budget. Then we moved into this time where it's kind of fast and loose and everything felt so cheap on Turk and other things. You were just like running stuff and then you'll see what happens and you just run anything. And then you get to this point now with pre-registration. To me, the p-hacking question aside, the key thing is it gives me a really good way to teach my graduate students to write down the hypothesis, fill out those tables again. And that makes the main point in pre-registration beyond the p-hacking part is to actually lay out the theory and lay out your assumptions, your hypothesis in a very clean and clear way so that it provides a nice iteration. And maybe some of the stuff makes it into the paper, maybe some of it doesn't. And to Joe's point, I also say that I'm an economist, so people still love theory over there. It still dominates. So I'm not worried about like theory disappearing from papers as much as, you know, the theory people talking to the empirical people. That remains a problem. But like, there's still a lot of folks out there in academia who love their theories.
Psychology too.
Yeah,
Love the
I wanted to add.
Everyone loves the theories. I know.
So to what David was saying, this is actually in surveys that we haven't done. It's a different group of researchers asking for benefits of people who do pre-registration. The number one benefit they mentioned, something like 75% of researchers, is that it allows them to think ahead better to the research they're going to be doing, even more than any sort of open science or lack of p-hacking. And another thought on that is, one advantage of, I think, a way in which, because there's a concern that there's like a fetishism with methodology in this credibility concerns, and we just want to reproduce specific experiments that may not speak to the general theory. And I think there's some truth to that concern. But the flip side of that is that if you want to test a theory that you may falsify, nothing beats a pre-registration that clearly stipulates the prediction that comes from theory. And then when you get that null effect, it's a lot easier to persuade people that it's worth publishing if it was both pre-registered and predicted by a clear theory. So I think even though there's some competition between theory and sort of the fetishization of FFX, there's also some synergy.
This reminds me what you just said. What's the goal of theory? Is it explanation or prediction? That's maybe a question that's relevant. I'd say prediction in the end.
Me too.
Sophie, I think you make an important point that there's a distinction between formal theory and informal theory, and a lot of our theorizing is relatively informal, I think, and we certainly could spell that out a bit better, including stuff that you may or may not think of as theory, just our sort of the assumptions that we bring to our work. And actually, you know, most of us here, I think, do quantitative work. One thing I've learned is that every discipline does something well, and one area where qualitative research maybe has something to bring is that they really embrace the subjectivity that we bring to our research, and we all do that because our questions come from somewhere. I think, you know, theory and observation go hand in hand. You build theories on robust observations, and then you use theories to make predictions that you then test. So you iterate, and you know, physics, a lot of the history of physics is just the ever more precise estimation of specific parameters. A lot of medical research is still effectively serendipitous. A lot of the things that theories were built around, oh, absolutely, most things that because it's messy, because actually it's incredibly hard to theorize about biological systems because they're so incredibly complex and noisy. And most stuff we find by chance. We give a drug to some people and, you know, it's intended for one thing, but the side effect means we end up with Viagra. So, you know, serendipity is a huge part of how we progress. And we need to also just recognize that, I think. And when we have observations that are very precisely wrong, people build edifices on the back of that. And we end up with a situation that we had with HDL and LDL cholesterol, for example, or the evidence that a small amount of alcohol consumption is good for you. Those findings are almost certainly wrong.
I want to be contrarian now. I think you're very cynical. I think there are plenty of very good clinical trials. I mean, just look at.
Oh, the trials are good. No, the trials are excellent. The trials are to a really high standard. But what you put into the trial, how you arrive at the compound, is often just by chance. Oh. People didn't theorize to get to Viagra. That's a great example. It was a side effect. It was, so a really good trial monitoring side effects showed a signal for something unexpected. That then went into its own trial, and it was shown to do this other thing as well. The trials were really robust, but arriving at that was serendipity.
But that is part of science. Science is
not exactly. So we don't want to obsess about one or the other. We just need to recognize that there's this kind of dance between really good observations, really good theory, and moving them forward together.
So basically, both exploratory and confirmatory. That's what Brian Nosek always talks about.
And I think one of the problems we have with our culture at the moment is we have to pretend everything was confirmatory. We have to tell a story as if we hypothesize, which is the great kind of satirical article about, you know, why all psychologists must have extrasensory perception or precognition, because everything we hypothesize turns out to be true. 95% of published articles in psychology show what we claimed they would show. Some of that is publication bias, but, you know, there are other things at play. And actually, being clear about, this is exploratory research. I'm not going to put a p-value on it. I'm just going to describe what I saw. I think there's a place for that.
And actually, this goes back to Joe's point. I remember years ago when I used to teach for the Open University, they had a really good piece of materials. This is an open university; anyone could sort of sign up to do a degree. And it was just an interview with Donald Broadbent. He was the guy who really got selective attention studies going in the UK. And all of his original work was done from really applied work with the Air Force, looking at people. The original headphones would play one message into one ear and the other message to another ear, and people kept crashing their planes. And Broadbent started looking at this, and a great deal of highly influential and highly replicable work on attention stemmed from that. And he said it has to be, you can take your problems from the real world, you can feed that back into your theory, and then ideally you take it back out into the real world. It's actually something that, it spins back out to where Joe was suggesting. We've got a few more minutes. Sorry, go on.
Can I ask Marcus a question on that, spinning it out? Because why are things not going from academia and into industry? Is there a gap in the funding model? Because there's funding for the discovery, and there seems to be funding via UKRI for the entrepreneurial bit, but the roll up, the scale up bits, like we see so many of our clients have got something that's near product ready, but it needs that transitional element. Is there something missing?
What kind of interaction are you talking about specifically? Are you talking about academics going into industry, or are you talking about industry coming to academia? And
it's academics going into industry. So academics who maybe have designed and tested and run an RCT to create an intervention that works in education, and they're like, well, I've done it and I can write my paper and it works. What do I do now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I think part of it is that our culture leads us to a model where we're sort of apprenticing undergraduates, then PhD students through to becoming professors. And most of them won't, but you never think it's going to be you that falls off the Ponzi scheme, if you like. And so we define success in those terms, which then makes people feel very uncomfortable about doing something other than the thing that we've defined as success. I think that's one of the problems. We need to have a much richer vision of what success looks like if you have academic skills, research skills, and want to pursue those. So I think part of it is that, and snobbery. I think part of it is the feeling that if you have made it within academia and you step too far out, it's kind of a one-way door. It's very hard to come back in again, which puts people off. I think we need to again think about ways in which we can create more of a revolving door, with people from industry coming into academia, people from academia going out into industry and back again, so that we exchange knowledge in that way. And I think there's also, again, you could think of it as a kind of snobbery thing to some extent. There's also a lot of, there are hierarchies everywhere. And one of the hierarchies is between more fundamental research versus more applied research. And in every field, that kind of hierarchy exists, I think. So I think there are lots of reasons, but it's certainly something that we could do a lot better. And one of the things that's happening in the UK that I think is healthy is that there's this people and culture strategy that's developing, linked into all of this other activity around research culture and so on, which is happening at a government level. And I think that's going to look at many of these things. One of the challenges is that academics often don't appreciate the standard that's required in industry, certainly in the pharmaceutical industry. And I think the pharmaceutical industry is a really interesting microcosm of incentives when you go from the discovery end, where there's much more of an incentive to get the right answer, and the marketing end, where there's a huge sunk cost bias. So that's not really answering your question, except to say it's complicated. There are lots of bits to it, and I think each one of those bits is important and deserves some attention.
No, but I thought what was really interesting that you said was how different industries do it, because doctors, if I'm right, doctors in the UK quite often have dual practice and academic positions, right? They do have one foot in each camp, and that massively helps the transfer of innovation from theory into practice and the other way. And maybe that's some of what we're missing in the behavioral sciences and education, is these dual appointments where you're expected to do both.
And you are starting to see those. There's one at Oxford, for example. Again, it's more in the sort of biomedical space, but I think that's right. I think that could be
I was going to add that I think on a good note that over the last few years, there's been a massive growth in real science being done in the tech industry. You know, when just 10 or 15 years ago, there really weren't options for reasonable kind of academic standard or at least academic style research outside of academia. People were moving away into places like consulting, et cetera, et cetera. That's opening up. I think Marcus's point, which I think is super interesting, I hadn't heard put this way, is the revolving door problem. Being able to go back and forth, which is, it really is a one-way street though. There's really no question about that. And I think part of it is people's in academia's misunderstanding of the type of research that can be done, the lack of transparency in the research that's done. But a part of it has to do with simply, at least in the US, the hiring process is still constrained with inside departments. And so even when academia recognizes that interdisciplinary and practical types of people are extremely useful to the university or schools, there aren't lines available. And I hope to see with the more emphasis on kind of computational social science in general, which cuts across departments, and other types of kind of newer information schools, there may be more of that coming, but that seems to be the main constraint. You have both these constraints fighting against each other, but definitely this main constraint of hiring lines within the department really constrain who can be hired back into academia.
There's one more point I want to make before we run out of time. Somebody touched upon, I don't remember who was, something about profitability and funding. I'm just going to share something that I don't think I've shared publicly before. In the very early days of Prolific, that was about 7 years ago, I actively thought about, should I make it a for-profit or a non-profit? And I was, after some thinking, I was very sure that I wanted to be a for-profit organization, because I never ever want to be begging funders for money. This is why academics have a problem. They have to keep begging for money and applying for grants, and it takes forever and it leads nowhere. And the decision process is arbitrary anyway. It's not even a good process. So I'd rather be for profit and then put the right checks and balances in place, having the right kind of board of directors or whatever, right? And then invest our own revenue back into building infrastructure, right? That seems like a much more prudent strategy than having to beg for the Arnold Foundation, which is the foundation that's, you know, putting a lot of money into the open science framework. So.
Thank you. I think we're going to need to start to wrap up. So I just want to say thank you to all the speakers. I thought that was a really interesting session and a lot of different points to go back into. In fact, I'm going to go find the recording of this on YouTube and watch it again. So I'd just like to finish by saying thank you to Uri, to Katya, to Marcus, to David, and I'm going to say thank you to Joe and hand over to Joe, because I think we're going to wrap up.